Your research began by looking at pro-Palestinian activism within football fandom. How does standing up for the rights of Palestinians spill over into football?
The conversations would not only be about the game and how beautiful the game was. It would be about, but this player is really supporting humanitarian causes. Or Barcelona has a nationalistic cause as a country. And as a result, Laji Celtic, which is like a football academy for children in Aida refugee camp, was established.
Is putting our energies into this kind of activism really the best use of our energies at all if we can't see it working? How much hope is there for the continued struggle for a free Palestine? To explore these questions, we're joined by the University of Edinburgh's Palestinian anthropologist, Dr Kholoud Al-Ajarma, sharing with us how her own family underwent multiple displacements and how her journey took her from a childhood which began in the Palestinian refugee camps to becoming an award-winning photographer and filmmaker.
People are really busy within these mundane issues that social justice issues come to be one of these issues on the side.
Why don't the Palestinians leave and seek a better life elsewhere? Assalamu alaikum, and on this episode of Thinking Islam, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Kholoud Al-Ajarma from the University of Edinburgh, who is here today, Kholoud, to talk to us about something which is timely, topical, but tragic in terms of the circumstances as to why we're talking about it and why now. But before we get into that, I'm sure our viewers and listeners would first want to know, who is Kholoud Al-Ajarma? Why is there a Palestinian woman sitting in our podcast studio who has a twinge of a Scottish accent when she speaks English? Go for it, please. Who are you?
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here with you. My name is Kholoud Al-Ajarma. I was born and raised in a place called Aida Refugee Camp, which is near Bethlehem in Palestine. My family are refugees from a village called Ajur. They were displaced in 1948, ended up in Bethlehem, and that's where they've lived ever since.
You mentioned Ajur and 1948. I remember reading about Ajur in 1948. I think it was in mid-1948, May, June time, when it was... Actually, I was doing some research about it, and would you believe they say it was depopulated? Is the word they use now to
Correct.
What's the word, to kind of wash away what actually happened there, which was ethnic cleansing. Can you tell us, because your family is from there, I know it's a painful history. What is the history of the village of Ajur? What happened there in 48?
In 1948, started in 1947, a lot of Palestinian villages, more than 500 Palestinian villages and towns, were attacked by the Jewish militias to set the stage for the establishment of the State of Israel. Before then, in the early 1900s, there was a plan to resettle European Jews into a new country, like a homeland. And there was the Zionist conference that took place at the time, and different countries were suggested as a place to this resettlement. Palestine was chosen at the end as the site that has like a biblical relevance to the Jewish populations, and the plan was to get migrants from everywhere to go to Palestine. There were organizations that were established to make that history, like the Jewish National Fund, which tried to buy the lands from the Palestinian inhabitants. And obviously the famous Balfour Declaration made by...
Or infamous, yes.
The infamous, made by Lord Balfour to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine was part of that plan to get Palestine depopulated from its original inhabitants to make space for the establishment of the Israeli state. Obviously, there was a UN resolution on that as well, but Palestinians rejected that plan. And up to 1947, out of all the historic land of Palestine, less than 6% was actually sold. And those were actually the landowners who weren't in Palestine at the time, who sold a bit of their lands. But the original people, the farmers, the peasants, they lived off that land and they refused to sell their lands. So they had to be depopulated by force, so ethnically cleansed. In many places, the militias attacked the villages. There were horrendous atrocities in Deir Yassin, for example, one of the villages of Jerusalem. There were massacres taking place. The children, the orphans from the village were paraded in Jerusalem to horrify the people from Jerusalem and the neighboring towns.
The Deir Yassin massacre, if I'm correct, took place before Ajur was attacked, isn't it? So,
Yes.
I mean, I can imagine your, forgive me if I'm wrong, but your mother's also must have been very young at that age, and your grandparents must have been there, must have heard from the neighboring villages the kind of atrocities that are taking place, and as a harbinger of what's to come, what can have been, I mean, you've heard from your parents, what can have been the state of mind that they underwent at that time?
It was very horrific because they knew about these massacres that were happening so close. And at the same time, they knew that they will be next. And many people, they were farmers, so they didn't have any weapons. Those lucky ones who did buy some sort of a gun at the time was from the British Army that left Palestine in 1948. And so the men stayed to fight in the village. And when Ajur itself was attacked in June, the men told the women and the children, run away to the neighboring villages until it's safer. When it's safer, you can come back. So my mother, who was 7 years old at the time, and my dad, who was 11, they lived with their parents. And they kept running until they reached Bethlehem. And my mom, one of the stories that she tells from that time is that how she realized that her feet, she ran barefoot, and she realized that her feet were bleeding when they stopped several villages away to take a break with her mom. Her mother had 4 children. They ended up in Beit Sahor, which is a neighboring town to Bethlehem. And in early the 1950s, the UNRWA, after the Nakba, the catastrophe took place, people didn't know what to do, and at the same time, internationally, Israel was established with international recognition. And the Nakba left 750,000 Palestinians displaced. Many of them ended up in what is now the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel, and many more in the neighboring country, from Syria to Lebanon to Jordan, and all around the world.
That is a very, as I said, a very painful history, or traumatic history of your parents' and grandparents' generation. How did Kholoud, who was born in that refugee camp, end up as Dr. Kholoud Al-Ajarma in now the University of Edinburgh? How did this happen?
Well, I was born as the youngest of 14 children. My parents had grown up in Ida refugee camp. They met, they got married. And throughout the years, they have, like, in my own history, I remember my mother and my grandmother, who were great storytellers. So they would sit and they would tell stories about how the life in Ajur was pre-1948, the types of foods they had, the music, how they'll do the harvest season, what they ate. And my grandmother, for example, would always speak about how figs were sweeter than honey in the village and how the figs we buy from the market don't compare. And I remember that she was a woman who never had any formal education, but she had so much knowledge about food, about the land, about the culture of Palestine. So that was, for me, the entry point into this knowledge. But at the same time, I grew up in the refugee camp, so I saw soldiers on a daily basis. And I saw how the army was chasing children all the time, and how our camp was ransacked with tear gas almost on a daily basis as well. But at the same time, for my parents, education was central. So they always said that to fight the enemy and to be strong, you have to be educated. And to be educated, you need to know your rights, you need to go to school and have a proper education. In the refugee camp and all around Palestine and in the diaspora where there are refugee camps, the United Nations Reliefs and Works Agency, which was established after the Nakba by the United Nations, runs these refugee camps. So they established schools. And that's where my siblings and I studied. But I had so many role models to look up to. So one of them was my uncle. So my dad couldn't finish school because he had to work and feed the family, but he insisted that his brother did, who was younger. And my uncle at the time, the West Bank and Jordan were together before 1967. And my uncle in the national exams of high school was the top on both Palestine and Jordan at the time. And he was somebody who grew up in the refugee camp, who had to study on the light of the candle, who had only one notebook, one pair of shoes. So whatever we had, or like my siblings and I, we would never live to the example of my uncle, who from almost nothing grew up to get his doctorate, and he was like the top student in both Palestine and Jordan at the time. So we had that role model, but also my parents themselves, who worked really hard to get us to get proper education. So my siblings were all good in school, so I had to live up to that. But at the same time, I found school boring to some extent because it wasn't as interesting as sitting to my grandma and the other ladies in the community. So when I was 14, I started doing like volunteering in a community center that was established at the time called Laji Center. And one of the first projects I was involved with was oral storytelling project. So we would go around, myself and the kids from the camp, and we will sit with the older generation, those who survived the Nakba, and hear stories about where they came from, and also about like traditional folk tales, traditional songs. And I found that really interesting, more so than what we learned in school, to be honest.
It might be a reason why you've been led into sociology rather than anything else, any of the hard sciences. But now, as a sociologist, in Edinburgh, having some insight into your background now, your ethnic background, your family background, the history, the Palestinian history that you've experienced and that you're a part of and that you're a product of, it's understandable why you would want to look at pro-Palestinian activism in Scotland. But your research began by looking at pro-Palestinian activism within football fandom. How did that happen and why look there?
Well, actually, I'm an anthropologist by training, but the journey into anthropology started when I was in Palestine, because I like to hear stories from people on the ground. When I did my master's degree, I worked with Palestinian diaspora in Chile, which is the largest Palestinian community outside the Arab region.
Okay.
And there I was introduced to the football club, the first Palestinian football club, which was established in 1920, the Palestino Football Club, which is a club that plays in the Premier League in Chile. It's very well known. It has thousands and thousands of fans, but it keeps a Palestinian identity to it because it was established by the Palestinian diaspora community, which made me think of how football fans were back home, where children would go out and would play football on the street. And it is a very popular game. And when I was growing up, I didn't understand why people liked football, to be honest. I felt that it's a group of young men, or in my case, were children, like running around after a ball.
Oh, me and you would not get on in that case.
Yeah. But at the same time, I remember how when Real Madrid and Barcelona would have a game, it would be like...
A Clasico, yeah.
Yeah, like when the Clasico happens, every cafe would be packed with people back home. And the conversations would not only be about the game and how beautiful the game was. It would be about, but this player is really supporting humanitarian causes. Or Barcelona has a nationalistic cause as a country, and the people would be talking about the Catalan people, for example. So it was always beyond actually people playing a football game. And that's where I got really interested in how people see football as a game and how sports as one avenue can be an avenue of solidarity with Palestine.
And then you've seen that happen in Scotland itself.
Yes.
However, picking up or eliciting and garnering some of that data for your research can't have been without its challenges.
Correct.
Speak to me about that.
So before I say that, it's one aspect that was also important in that relationship with, especially with the Celtic football team, was in 2016 when they raised the Palestinian flags and in one of their games against an Israeli team. And at the time they were fined. So they were fined, I think, around £10,000. And the Green Brigade, which is like the ultra fan group, decided to match that from funding raised by the fans and to send that to Palestine, to an organization, Laji Center, where I worked at the time, and to Medical Aid for Palestine. And it was a very noble cause. So to see also the fans, how the fans react in these situations.
So at this time in 2016, you were still in Palestine, in the Laji Center.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So, and because of that, I got really interested in like how that process will happen. And I was surprised because, well, they wanted to match fund the fine, so to raise something like £10,000. And I thought at the time that's still good. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's still good. We can buy some sport shoes for the children and some maybe sport clothes as well. And then the fans raised something like £140,000,
Wow.
which was a huge amount.
Yeah.
And my brother, who was one of the founders of Laji Center at the time, came up to Scotland and received the amount as well. And as a result, Laji Celtic, which is like a football academy for children in Ida refugee camp, was established. And the link with Celtic is still ongoing. So that was my entry point. So it was not very difficult to get to go into a Celtic game. That how it started, and it was really a lot of fun to be there and to hear the chants and to be with all these fans. There were thousands at the Celtic Park, and I started talking to people there. And from there, in anthropology, we talk to people a lot, obviously, and I used snowball sampling as a method. So we start with one person, and through that person, we get to more people who might be interested in the research.
So, I mean, we know even before 2016, Celtic has historically been one of those, we can say, or the fans community of Celtic has been one of those cohorts which has a left-leaning kind of outlook. But since the solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians has been highlighted there, it also has been spreading, especially because of the more recent tragedy post-October 7th that we have. We've seen now Palestinian flags being raised in football matches, not only across the UK, but across Europe, and fan communities holding up banners to associate themselves with the pro-Palestinian movements as well. Even though some football clubs were threatened with fines, you see the fan communities again raising pro-Palestinian banners. We saw that at PSG more recently in the Champions League semi-final, although it was a bit heartbreaking for me because we were knocked out by PSG anyway. But in any case, we see some clubs as the club itself, not the fans, the clubs coming down as financial organizations harshly on some of their members or employees who have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian movement, whereby the fans having a different kind of outlook. So there's that kind of separation, maybe financially driven, you can say, perhaps. Yeah. But your exploration of the fans, even at Celtic, can't have gone past a certain point where after which you had to look beyond that, or not?
I agree with your point completely. I think the management, even in football culture, the management of these clubs is different from the fandoms. It's a bit different when you think about Bohemian, for example, which is the oldest football club in Ireland, which is 100% fan-owned football club. And the politics there becomes a bit different. But when it's a corporate in one way or another, there is the funders to think about. There is the where all the money is coming from to think about. So that's why the fans are different. And the Green Brigade specifically within the fandom of the Celtic is very pro-Palestine, but also pro other causes that are humanitarian causes. Some are like anti-fascist causes. And that's really important to see the fans as people who are beyond people who like football or like to play or like to support football games.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, we can't essentialize them to football.
Yeah.
But did you get some sense from them that whilst we know the popular media, especially in the Western world, has a huge pro-Zionist bias to it, sanitizes the genocide, supports the facilitation of that genocide by this government? Did the fans, could you see them bringing in those aspects of themselves, the humanitarian causes, humanitarian empathy that they had with the Palestinians into the football, and they're using that as a space to, against the frustration of not being able to say something outside perhaps?
Absolutely. So the fans were bringing in, for example, Palestinian flags or wearing kufiyas in the matches, talking to others about what is happening in Palestine. And throughout the game, you would see, and I think, I'm not sure about the exact number, but the fans are allowed to carry certain number of banners throughout the games. So when they hold a Palestinian flag, that means that they're substituting it for another flag that they could be holding. So they're holding Palestinian flags, they're holding the Irish flag, for example, because there is like the link with the Irish diaspora. And to hold Palestinian banners is also very, very strong. And when the Celtic fans carried a banner that said victory for the resistance after October 7th, they were actually banned from all abroad games. 250 members of the Celtic fan club actually were banned as like one of the measures that we're taking against them from the management. So there is that aspect as well. There is a risk in saying things and also in being in solidarity. But also the fans still fight back, which is also important. And at the same time, correct, it's not easy neither for them, neither to be researching them. In that sense.
I can't imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, about your participant pool. When we talk about football fans at Celtic, I can't imagine many of them, if any, would have been Arab in ethnic background or Muslim in terms of their religious investedness with the Palestinians. What was your participant pool like in terms of the demographic?
It was very diverse, but mostly white. Young men more than anything. There were a couple of women fans. One actually of fourth Palestinian background. But yeah, most of them were younger, very bright, but also very white young men.
So without having the investedness with ethnic background, nationalistic investedness, if you like, or without having a religious inclination or affiliation, what was their impetus? What was the driving force behind this activism?
The driving force is the humanity. They see Palestine and Gaza currently as a human cause, and that to be on the right side of history means to support the Palestinian struggle. Obviously, it's not out of vacuum, because especially for Catholic Scottish people who come from an Irish background, there is that link with the Irish struggle. So there is the link with the colonization, to be anti-colonial, to be anti-imperialist, to be anti-British to some extent. And they see also like the historical roots. Britain had a great role in the colonization of Palestine and also in the colonization of Ireland. So they see that as a common link often.
So the colonialist narrative we have now wishes to Islamicize the Palestinian struggle
Yes.
and activism with the Palestinians. This demographic that you're pointing to, neither Arabs ethnically nor Muslims, does that help, do you think, in breaking that false essentialization of the Palestinian struggle with Islam or Islamization? Does it help in that way?
I believe so. I think
And is that important at all? Should that be the case?
I think it is important to acknowledge that the solidarity with Palestine doesn't come only from religious or ethnic backgrounds. It comes from a human connection with Palestine. It comes from a belief in justice and what justice should look like. And at the same time, for many of those people, it also breaks these stereotypes about that the supporters of Palestine are either Muslim or Arab or come from certain ethnic backgrounds. And that's why I was interested in looking at people who might otherwise be ignored or their narratives be ignored. And I've seen that all across, not only in the current genocide, but even in wars that happened before. When I was here during one of the previous wars on Gaza, the headlines were Muslims marching in support of Gaza. But if just looking at the picture, you could see that people who were marching were not only Muslim. And this idea of using Islamophobia, for example, to mask the support for Palestine is really appalling.
Do you see, on the flip side, actually,
Yeah.
when we see the pictures of those marching in support of Gaza and the Palestinian cause, a lot of them being non-Muslim, white, if you like, in terms of their race or ethnic background, is there an apathy amongst Muslims as that they cannot be seen in the forefront? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Am I wrong in saying there's an apathy? And even if you look at the boycott movements and the BDS and when you walk past some of the places in London city centre, the Starbucks and if it's filled with people with headscarves on and visibly Muslim, is there an issue here? Yes, we have allies standing up for the Palestinian cause, but what does that say about the apathy of Muslims or Arabs themselves who are somewhat laid back, whereas, with the current genocide?
Well, I think Muslims are a very heterogeneous group, and to put them all under one umbrella is very wrong. Within Muslims themselves, there are people who are obviously pro-Palestinian. In this country, there's Friends of Al-Aqsa, for example, who through many, many years have been supporting Palestine. Many Muslims, I think, see Palestine also as a charity cause. So if they give some zakat or some money, then they feel that I'm more relaxed about my role in the struggle. And we cannot oversee that Muslims in this country and in many Western countries, they're under a lot of scrutiny. So they are being accused of all kinds of accusations, including anti-Semitism, including hate speech, and so on. So I think there is also that fear of being persecuted because of solidarity with Palestine. When it comes to things like the BDS, it's absolutely essential, but as with everyone else, you would see in these cafes Muslims, but you would see non-Muslims, and you would wonder where is their ethical stance on this? So there is always that question. But I think Muslims, as all other communities, they're very heterogeneous, and they have so many different ways that they show solidarity with Palestine. Some people come on pilgrimages to Jerusalem, for example, and visit Palestinian communities. Some people do zakat and charity work. Some people are involved actually in the BDS movement and in the Palestine solidarity work. Not to the same extent, I would say, as those who are not Muslim. And sometimes even some of my friends who are not Muslim would say, why don't we see more Muslims engaged in this activity or that one? But I think this current genocide have really opened the eyes of many people towards what is happening in Palestine and motivated many, including the Muslim community, to act more.
Kholoud, we mentioned the responsibilities we have, and some of us are living up to them, some of us are not living up to them. We've seen the energy being put in by activists. A lot of what we saw over the last couple of years was brave movements by students on university campuses. We've seen the marches in London, in other cities, and we spoke about the demographic which takes part in those marches as well. Aside from individual responsibility, what responsibilities, what forms of activism do you suggest can be played by educational organizations? Islamic organizations, if they're community-led, we can see what kind of work they're doing, charitable work, etc. Educational organizations, academic institutions, and academicians themselves. We know that the revolutionary movements, even that in South Africa, was really, a lot of it was student-led, and the impact that students had was tremendous. What role, beyond students who have already played a great role, can academia itself play here? What role should be played here?
I think on the individual level, we have seen a lot of activism coming from staff at universities who have shown support through decolonizing the narrative, through making the classroom a space where people can actually come together and speak, and where students can voice their opinions about what is happening in the world. I've got to say, before the current genocide, when people were discussing this current younger generation, they would say, oh, they're all into TikTok and this and that, and they're really not into politics. But we were shown that this is not actually true. We saw the encampments all across the world. In Edinburgh is just one example, but throughout the US and Europe, and these encampments were spaces where people were coming together, where students were voicing their complaints about the university management's complicity in what is happening. And I think the way forward is actually for these demands to be met. So the students, also the staff at universities, they have been calling on management to cut ties, to start with companies and investments that are benefiting from or profiting from the genocide or from the Israeli state as well. And many of these educational institutes, they are dealing with it as corporates as well. So they're thinking about their own investments rather than the results of these investments. And I think the way forward is actually for them to take a step and actually to evaluate their investments, to join the BDS, and especially divestments and sanctions. And that would actually make a difference, which also made a difference in the case of apartheid South Africa.
Well, you yourself, of course, as an academic, as an anthropologist, you are also an activist.
Mm.
That's part of your positionality in all of your research, in you as a person. So I'm asking you as an activist. You mentioned all of these movements, the encampments, the innumerable different ways that activists have been working. But Kholoud, 77 years, when the ethnic cleansing from this colonial project called Israel began, we haven't seen the ethnic cleansing abating. Mm-hmm. If anything, we've seen more expansion and more land theft. If anything, 2014, 2021, and now we've seen the massacres accelerating, augmenting. We've seen the ethnic cleansing only increasing. Then if that's the case, is putting our energies into this kind of activism really the best use of our energies at all, if we can't see it working?
I think being active for the right causes is part of our individual responsibility, first towards ourselves and then towards the world and the community around us. And to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say that I have done my part here. I don't see that it's a lost cause, because if we all say that, then no one will actually work for justice. I do see the value in the communities that are being established, from small community gatherings happening in cities and universities all around the world to larger movements that are calling for BDS and also for sanctions against Israel. Normally, the colonization takes time and decolonization takes time as well. So it is really important to keep the movement going so that one day there'll actually be a result on the ground. And we see the result. It's true that it's frustrating. It's true that it's very slow, but it is important to do it, and it's important to keep the momentum. Unfortunately, our governments, the governments in Europe and the US and many other parts of the world, they're complicit in what is happening. They're benefiting from the genocide, and they're also benefiting from this colonial entity that has existed for over 70 years. And because of that, we should see the current Israeli apartheid system within the larger system of these very colonial powers that still exist, maybe not in the same way like in the 19th century or early 20th century, but they still exist. And it's really important to resist those systems as well and to decolonize them from within. The unfortunate part, and I think Palestinians saw this, but also people all over the world, is how fast these governments were willing to act when the Russia invasion of Ukraine took place. So, for example, the FIFA banned the Russian football team. The European Federation banned them from participating in European games. And we didn't see the same happening towards Israel. And Israel is not even a European country, but still plays in the European League. So it's really important to hold these people responsible and accountable for their actions. And maybe they are not acting now, but with more pressure, they will have to act one day. And one day when this is all over, they'll come around and they'll say, oh, well, but we were not that bad to start with. But I think this pressure and this momentum is really important to keep it going. Otherwise, history will come back and question all of us.
It's really funny, actually, what you pointed out, the irony there that the colonial state wishes to be identified as indigenous to the Middle East, not European, whilst wanting also to play in European, recognizing that they are Europeans, actually, and not indigenous to the Middle East at all. You spoke about the hypocrisy with the Russia-Ukraine situation and the double standards that exist there. One instance of that double standards is how the government in this country has come down harshly on pro-Palestinian activists. And the instance of that we've just seen is what can only be described as the utter abuse of anti-terrorism law in this country, where we have just seen the Palestine Action organization being prescribed as a terrorist movement or organization, whereby supporting them in any way could also land someone in jail. Now, with pro-Palestinian activists in this country, of course, this move by the government was, the motivation behind it was to instill fear in activists. What message would you have for individual activists? You can imagine students, if they get blacklisted, that's the rest of their lives, tarnished. People who are professionals, have careers, have jobs, have families to feed, in the back of their minds whenever they want to attend a pro-Palestinian demonstration would have, if I'm seen to support XYZ, if I'm seen to be around where a certain chant is taking place, even if that chant is legitimate, ethically speaking, I could be blacklisted, I could be sacked from my job, lose my livelihood. We've seen the chants that took place in Glastonbury Festival just now, and the people who initiated those chants have had their visas from the USA revoked. And what message would you have for potential activists when they are facing this kind of fear?
It is important for activists who are currently active or those who are wanting to be active is to know the consequences that might be accompanied with their activism. This, as you mentioned, can be being sacked from university or from a job or spoken about in a certain way. But as long as the person is aware of what they are doing and they are willing to take the risk, then I would tell them to do what they believe in. Because at the end of the day, if they're not doing anything that is legally wrong, and if their support of Palestine doesn't harm those around them, which it shouldn't.
Kholoud, you said legally wrong. At one point, legally speaking, Nelson Mandela was a terrorist.
Yeah, correct.
So when you say doing something which is legally wrong, what Palestine Action we're doing now in terms of taking direct action to stop or to try and raise awareness, not even stop, but try and raise awareness about a genocide is now legally wrong. So an activist who would have to go beyond Rosa Parks sitting where she was sitting was legally wrong. What's legal, what's ethical is a minefield to cross. We would expect people to go beyond, for the sake of justice, the scope of what's defined as legal at some points.
Yeah, but the legal is human-made.
Absolutely.
And if the legal now is wrong, then that's where the question of ethics comes in.
Exactly.
So people have to act with what they think or what they believe is ethically and morally right. But also these legal issues has to be changed because the humans are the ones who put the laws. And if the law is unjust, it is humans who have to work to change that law. It is not the case that we should now stop Palestinian activism because Palestine Action or other organizations are deemed as terrorist organizations. We have to fight back these laws because these laws themselves are wrong and they are encroachment on people's rights to expression, people's rights to express that they are against the complicity of the state in the genocide. And the right step moving forward is to challenge these laws, to change them back, to take the right track to history, not to be reserved and to stop activism because there'll be consequences. Although I started looking at football specifically and specifically as well within like these anti-colonial, anti-imperialist fandoms, including Celtic, but other football teams. When I started meeting people and interviewing people, I also started looking at people who have not been active for Palestine and that these atrocities in the past couple of years have motivated them to actually take a move and join different organizations. So I interviewed people who are in the health system, people who are artists, people who work in different walks of life, who have been involved in maybe in other causes like against the war in Vietnam or against the apartheid in South Africa, but have not been active for Palestine. But seeing the complicity of the state and also of the media and how these issues have affected people's everyday lives, they have started joining groups. So they've joined, there's a group in Edinburgh, for example, called Health Workers for Palestine. There is an emergency group that was also established in the past couple of years to support the rallies that happen every week. There are vigils that are happening, art events, cultural events, and all of them are for the sake of raising awareness about what is happening in Palestine and also supporting Palestinian students and artists and medics and so on. So I think that's important to highlight, and that's why I broadened the scope of my research to look at all these other people who have been involved in the past couple of years.
It's very interesting, actually, that you mentioned that since people who would have stood up for social justice movements or political movements many years ago when it comes to South Africa may have stood up for an instance of injustice or against an instance of injustice. For Vietnam, the same kind of thing. However, with the current genocide taking place and that reawakening of the same people, people are able, due to that, maybe to build that thread of, instead of looking at them as individual instances of injustice, as the thread of colonialism running through and racism really running through, and like kind of reigniting that in themselves, not to see it as a separate instance now that we have to stand up for another humanitarian cause, but seeing the bigger picture of what's going on now. And maybe that's another approach from the grassroots to look at it in a different way. It might be a better way to tackle things.
Correct. And people are saying the struggle for Palestinian justice as a broader struggle for global justice. And when we see the struggle of Palestinians, we see it as one against imperialism, against neoliberal systems, against injustice in all its forms. And that's what people are rallying around when it comes to Palestine. But of course, there are also fears that people have. So, for example, how the anti-Semitism has been used in this country and many European and Western countries to suppress talk on Palestine and to make people more silent on when it comes to Palestine. And it's a very serious accusation. So that is also something that people have to worry about when they speak up.
You know, one of the observations, we were at a conference a couple of days back, one of the observations to your research was that the demographic of your participants were either youngsters, and we know the university encampments we've spoken about, or there were those who might have now exited the workforce and maybe of retirement age. And there was a dearth in the middle, which was not part of your participants. Why do you think that was?
I think in general, people in between are very busy in this format of life that we live in. It's a very neoliberal kind of way of living where you have to feed your family, you have to work. So you work from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. You go home, you're tired, you have a family, you have kids. And that means that within this period of life, people are really busy within these mundane issues, that social justice issues come to be one of these issues on the side. Whereas people who are closer to retirement or have retired, they have more time on their hands. And people who are still in universities, they see it as part of their engagement within university life, many of them. So, yeah, we do see that across the solidarity movement, actually, that not many, unless they are like proficiently engaged, so they work in a human rights organization or a legal organization or something like that, you see many people drop out of the solidarity movement in that age period, mainly because of how busy life is and how people run after survival in these words.
I mean, the shame of this is when you need people who can cause impact, who can be influential, it normally rotates around people who are financially powerful.
Yeah.
That doesn't include students who don't earn and don't pay taxes, and it doesn't include those who are of past working force age who, again, don't probably have a regular income. The most powerful demographic age demographic would be those right in the middle, and it's only once they begin to contribute to these causes that you can see an impact there.
Yeah, they are contributing. There are some people who are active actually within the movement, but it's not as many as you would like to see.
Kholoud, we know and we've spoken about how difficult life is for the Palestinians, especially in the current wave, the genocide in Gaza taking place now, the pogroms, for want of a better word, happening in the West Bank, which is even less documented in the media and the news. We don't even hear about it in Western media. How difficult life is for the rest of, forget the West Bank and Gaza, in the rest of occupied Palestine. Question that would come to people's minds is, why don't the Palestinians, in that case, leave and seek a better life elsewhere?
Well, Palestinians don't want to leave because they want to stay on their homeland and their lands, and that because they believe in their right in the land. My family, for example, left Al-Jur in 1948, but still my grandmother has the land deeds that prove that these lands were never sold. And that's also one of the Israeli propaganda that goes around, that Palestinians sold their lands in 1948 and they were not ethnically cleansed, which is not true. And just speaking to that generation, you would know that these lands were never sold. The Palestinians never gave up on their right of return, for example. And people still want to return to their lands if that is possible. On the other hand, it's also important to remember that the Palestinians have the right in their lands, but also that they don't want to leave. They want to live in dignity, but on their own lands. There have been many chances for people to leave in the past. There are chances for people to leave now. Maybe not in Gaza at the moment, but there are different types of struggles that Palestinians have to live through. So people have to think about their families. They have to think about, do I want to remain here and suffer, or do I want to go somewhere else and suffer still because they won't be in their homelands? And I think I'm not the one to tell people what to do, but in the case of my family, for example, in 1967, Aida refugee camp and the whole West Bank was occupied by Israel for the second time. And what they did at the time is that they came with loudspeakers. They told people, if you don't leave, we're going to destroy the camp on your heads. And many people were scared, obviously, and around 200,000 new refugees were the result of 1967. And many people crossed the border with Jordan, where they were bombed even there. But my grandmother and many women from our community were like, where are you going to take us to? In 1948, we were told, you can leave your village for a couple of weeks. When it's safe, you will return. And we never returned. So if we're meant to die, we'll die in our land. If we're meant to die, we'll die here. And they refused to leave. At the time, they raised white flags on the roofs of their houses, and they were spared. Obviously, that wasn't the case in many other places, but luckily it was the case in Aida camp. So, and my family, my father, for example, would say, I would never leave, even if they would come and destroy the house on our heads. This is our land, and unless the only way we will leave, if we leave to go back to Adjur, if we leave to go back to our homeland, we're not leaving to go outside of Palestine. And for many people in Gaza now, it might be the case that they do want to leave because people are tired. People are tired of seeing the genocide day after day, of not even being able to mourn their loved ones, not being able to bury them properly. So it wouldn't be up to me or for anyone else to decide on their behalf. I think if there is an opportunity, some people might choose to leave. If there is a place where that is actually safer and where their human rights and dignity are met, because people also don't want to leave and end up in the desert in the middle of nowhere with no rights and to run away from misery to even more misery. But at the end of the day, it is the people themselves who have to take that choice, or maybe not choice in this case, because whatever it is, people, in a way, they're forced to keep up with life.
Is there a chance, we said there's a chance for people to leave? Are there safe passages for Palestinians to leave, maybe into the neighboring countries? Are there those routes available still?
I don't think there are routes available for safe passage. I think some Palestinians in the West Bank is very different from Gaza, and that's also different for Palestinians in Jerusalem and Palestinians in Israel, because that's the apartheid system that we live under. Different people have different rights and different ways of access depending on where they live. In Gaza, for example, the only way to the outside world, even before the current genocide, was the Rafah crossing with Egypt. And that crossing was very heavily controlled by Israel at the time still, and later by Hamas and as the government of Gaza and the Egyptian government. And those who used to go out for medical reasons or for pilgrimage or for other reasons, it was very heavily securitized. So it wasn't an easy passage. And during the genocide, it was even worse, because people had to pay thousands of pounds to be able to get their families out, those who could financially manage it anyway.
Hang on, who Who is the recipient of these thousands of pounds for one crossing to move from Gaza into Egypt? Who takes these thousands of pounds?
The Egyptian government.
Right. So really exploiting the situation that the Gazans are in.
Yeah, unfortunately, the neighboring governments have not only been complicit in what is happening, they have profited from the atrocities, which is unfortunate. And this doesn't reflect, obviously, on the people themselves who are against what is happening, but the governments themselves. So, for example, the organization that is under the Egyptian government that maintains the Rafah crossing on the Egyptian side, they took something like $500 from every person who was leaving Gaza into Egypt. A friend of mine who's based in St. Andrews had 7 members of her family come out from Gaza, and she had to carry in cash £35,000 that she had raised in order to go and take her family out into safety.
To escape genocide.
To escape genocide. And even and it was the generosity of people who donated to her campaign to be able to get her family out. And even now that they're out, it's really difficult for them. Her father says, I wish I didn't leave, because even though he's relatively in safety, he sees every day the horrors of people that he knows personally, his neighbors, his friends, the rest of his family. And at the same time, he's being exploited in Egypt because, the banking system is corrupt, the housing system is corrupt, and they have to live in that system where they have minimal rights, if any. So it's really difficult for people if people just want to live a normal life and to get by, but at the same time, there are countries and systems that are benefiting from this genocide. And it's very upsetting to see the complicity of the neighboring countries, but also of countries like the US that had billions and billions pounds worth of army aid and weapons sent to Israel. This country, the UK, other countries in Europe that have maintained relationships to Israel, not only relationships, but arms sales.
Enabling the genocide.
Enabling the genocide, actively participating in the genocide that is happening in Palestine. In the West Bank, it's a bit different. It's a bit easier, let's say. There are checkpoints between cities and ghettoed communities in a way, because people cannot go from one place to the other freely. If they want to leave Palestine, we have to leave through Jordan. We can't use the Israeli cities. For example, we cannot fly via Tel Aviv. That's not allowed.
So hang on. You have family still in Palestine.
Yeah.
You mentioned your grandmother is still there?
No, she passed away.
She passed away. Your mother is still there.
Yes.
So when you want to visit her, you can't fly into Tel Aviv. Is that? I don't understand that. How does that work then? How do you get to your family?
Well, Israel is an apartheid state, so Palestinians are not allowed to use the...
Palestinians are not allowed to fly into Tel Aviv?
Yes.
So how do you get to your family?
For Palestinians in the West Bank, not only myself, we have to fly into Jordan, and then we go by land into the Jordan crossing, which is the border with... the border is controlled by Jordan from the Jordanian side and by Israel from the Palestinian side.
Even in the West Bank?
Even in the West Bank, yeah. Well, the West Bank has a de facto authority, but the authority doesn't control, security-wise. We don't have an army. We have police, which is a civil police.
So while we see on the maps this manipulative map, if you like, or deceptive map, of Gaza cordoned off and the West Bank cordoned off as if this belongs to Palestinians, this is not the case at all.
No. So as per the Oslo Agreement, which was signed between the Palestine Liberation Organization in the early 1990s and Israel, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C. So Area A is under Palestinian control, which is civil control, and that is only about 22% of the West Bank. The rest is areas B and C, and area C is the largest. It's where all the fertile land is, it's where the water resources are, and that's under full Israeli control. That's where Israel has installed settlements all over the lands that are owned by Palestinians. About 500,000 Israeli settlers live there illegally. And to go from one community to the other as a Palestinian, we have to go through Israeli checkpoints. So, for example, and that's not to mention Jerusalem. Jerusalem, it's on its own, is part of that apartheid system. From Bethlehem to Jerusalem is about 15 minutes, but it's easier for me to come here than to go to Jerusalem from Bethlehem.
Easier for you to come
all the way
to the
here.
UK
Yes.
than to get 15 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, because there are checkpoints and we are not allowed through those checkpoints unless we have an Israeli permit. So to be able to come here, for example, I have to go through, we have to drive to Jericho. That's where the Palestinian controlled area is. And then from there, we go to the Israeli border, if you will, and then to the Jordanian border. On the way back, it's the same. And every time a Palestinian leaves, they also have to pay an Israeli tax, because you asked about who the money goes to. So every Palestinian who leaves Palestine have to pay a tax to the Israeli side to be able to leave. And even when we are allowed to go, we don't know until we get to the border if we'll be allowed out, because there are people who are blacklisted or people who have a political record, for example. So when they get to the border, they would be told, turn back and go home because you're not allowed, or they'll be arrested in some cases. So we don't know until we are on the Jordanian side that we can breathe, that we're out. And then from there, we can fly to other places. And obviously, we need visas for many countries, including the UK. But for us, I see myself in a place of privilege still, because I can go in and out. There are many Palestinians who can't go in and out. And there are many people who live in areas like Aida refugee camp is within Bethlehem, which is relatively a safer city to live in. In Hebron, for example, the city itself is divided into what is called H1 and H2. And in parts of the city, the Israeli settlers have taken over the Palestinian houses that Palestinians themselves cannot live in parts of their houses.
In parts of it. So they're living in the house.
Yes.
With colonialist settlers who have stolen their house, also living in the same house.
In many cases, yes. And that's because they would take it over maybe sometimes when the family is not there, and then they'll refuse to leave and they're packed by the Israeli army. And sometimes because if they living, for example, on the first floor, the army will take over the second floor, and then the army will facilitate for the settlers to come in. And it's really heartbreaking. I remember once I went to Hebron with a friend, and a Palestinian woman was standing and having an argument with an Israeli soldier who had a clear American accent, I remember. And there's a street called Shuhada Street down from just round the corner from the Abrahami Mosque in Hebron. And he wasn't allowing her into her own house, which was 100 meters away. And he was saying that her name in his record is different from her name on the ID. And in Palestine, sometimes the women, when they get married, they take the husband's family name. So in his record, it was a different name than in her ID. And he wasn't allowing her in her own house. And we could see the children looking from the window at their mom downstairs, and she's not able to come to the house until one of the kids ran out with a piece of paper that showed the marriage certificate. And it was really heartbreaking because in Palestine, we're a very generous society. So after I stood with my friend with her, not to leave her alone with the soldier, and after her issue was solved and she was allowed into her house, she was like, oh, why don't you come for a cup of tea? And I knew, and she knew, that have we said yes, we won't be able to go with her because she almost wasn't able to go to her own house. So these are the kinds of stories that are part of the everyday life for Palestinians.
These stories of everyday life are stories of humiliation, of degradation, and of dehumanization. And we know dehumanization is a precursor to extermination. The point here is to kill Palestinians. But if you're saying that the Palestinians themselves don't know whether when they want to leave, they'll be able to leave, what possible benefit is there for the Israelis to keep the Palestinians there and not allow them to leave?
Well, that's one of the questions that I always think about, but also some scholars have wrote about when it comes to the Zionist mentality behind the colonization of Palestine. And one of the reasons, I think, is to keep an enemy out there so that Israel would continue to play the role of the victim, that it is defending itself against these people who want it to cease to exist, and that there are enemies all around in the Middle East, and that it has the right to defend itself and to exist against all these odds. And in doing so, it keeps the Palestinian population under control. And at the same time, for a long time, the Palestinian population was a cheap labor population. So they got the Palestinians to work in settlements or to work building Israeli cities, because the Palestinians also had no option. And at the same time, that population is a population where they get to experiment. So Israel exports torture methods to the world. It exports surveillance methods. Its technology and arms manufacturing is very well advanced. And all these weapons are tested on Palestinians first. We see this in Gaza today, but it has been going for many, many years in all over historic Palestine. And because we are the test subjects, let's say, we're still there. But I do think that although they try to exterminate us and that they try to take away our humanity, the humanity does exist despite all that. And I think that is also what sometimes drives them and the Zionists in general crazy. So even after all this, even after all the suffering and after all the killing, people maintain their humanity, people maintain going to school, they maintain wanting to live a life of dignity. And that is something that is really hard to maintain. And that's where we say the spirit of steadfastness, the sumud, comes in. And that despite all this horror, the humanity still prevails.
You mentioned trying to live a normal life, going to school, going to work, but in a day-to-day environment like this, getting past a checkpoint, I mean, for us to come to work, if I leave home and I'm here in 20 minutes, it can't be the same. Going to school must be a different kind of going to school. Going to work must be a different experience than some of us in this privileged part of the world experience.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's very different. And I remember the very first time I came to the UK, I was 19. When I was coming with a group of dancers, we performed Palestinian traditional dance as a way of Dabki, yes, to spread the information about Palestine through art. And also we did film and photography work that we exhibited here. And I remember our first stop was in Hull, up in the north of the UK. And we took a bus from London. And maybe 2/3 into the journey, Salah, my brother, was speaking on the mic. And he said to everyone, "Oh, we'll stop in 20 minutes. There's a checkpoint." And everyone was like, for maybe 10 seconds, everyone went silent. And then they realized, actually, there are no checkpoints here. But that's like part of the daily life of Palestinians, that if we didn't experience anything else, we would think that that was normal. And it's really eye-opening to see how normal life, if you will, is away from these daily invasions, away from these checkpoints. And if we start to talk about the trauma that all this is causing, it's a different story, and we'll need another podcast. But it's very hard.
Especially on the back of this current phase of genocide, the trauma of it is bound to last generations.
Absolutely. Well, in the Palestinian context, we don't talk about PTSD. We talk about ongoing trauma because there's no post in our experience. And I think, I didn't live the Nakba myself, but I grew up with the stories of my mother who lived the Nakba. And in many ways, I feel sometimes that I lived it. I remember in the very first days of the current genocide, there was an image in the media of a little girl carrying her even smaller sister and walking barefoot in the rubbled streets of Gaza. And to me, that was like my memory, or my imagined memory of my mother in the Nakba coming to life. And it was really heartbreaking because to see that happen again and even arguably to a greater extent than in the Nakba. The numbers of refugees and displaced people is definitely more than in the Nakba. The number of those who were killed is more than the Nakba. And the magnitude of the destruction as well that happened in Gaza, and which will need years, even if the war stops today, it will need years to rebuild, and all the trauma that will carry on with the people. But I think it needs to end first, and then we can work out the other things, including mourning, including thinking about those who passed and those who remained, and people allowing people to mourn and to go back to school and to go back to some sort of normality is really what people really want at the moment.
I mean, we lived in a different world. We didn't live. I wasn't there, of course, in the time of the first Nakba.
Yeah.
Of course, this time is much more severe.
Absolutely.
I don't know if we would have seen at that time, or if humanity is degraded so badly that we can not only see such an intense phase of genocide, but the whole, or at least the governments of the whole world cheering it on, enabling it and facilitating it, and excusing it and justifying it, rather than doing anything, to the contrary.
Absolutely. And one of the things that when I grew up was hearing all the time, people didn't know at the time what was going on in Palestine.
I mean, this genocide is being live streamed to all of our screens.
Absolutely. And you would still find people who would make excuses for it to happen, and people who would benefit from it or profit from it.
Before we close, in this Thinking Islam podcast series, we like to close the podcast by asking the guest, what next? What now? What's the solution? Is there hope? I think I saw either you had posted something or liked something on social media, or I saw it somewhere anyway, was the image of a watermelon rotting away, going underground and then re-flourishing or regrowing again. Do we see that regrowth? Is there a beacon of hope through all this activism for Palestine, one, and for the wider issue that Palestine is one instance of, two? What's the future looking like?
I think there is hope, and that's what keeps people going. In Palestine, people see hope through the actions that people outside are contributing to, and in every act of solidarity and every success of the BDS movement. They don't see it in the current governments or representatives of these governments, but they see it in people, in grassroots, in people of every walk of life who stand with justice. And people believe that justice will prevail. It might take time, it might be a difficult road to walk, but it will, at the end, come back. And I used this image in my presentation of the watermelon, but there is also another one. Once I went to my home village to visit. It was a very long process and very difficult, but there was an olive tree and it was dying, but from the very roots of the olive tree, there was a sprout of a new one coming up. And I think, and that's what the older generations of Palestinians always say, is that we might die, but the cause will not die. And also, even if the old die, the young will not forget. And that remembrance is important, to remember and to act, and also to name things for what they are. So it's important to decolonize our language, to call it genocide, to call it apartheid, to call it settler colonialism. And when we start spreading that language and when we start realizing the meanings of these words, it is when actually action will happen and change will happen. And I do believe that change will come around. It might take time, but people are waking up and we are seeing an awakening that is started from Gaza and spreading all over the world.
So one more question, and that to you is, what is your question? You've carried out this research. We've been speaking about this topic. What question do you have in your mind? What are you asking yourself that we really need to discover now?
One question that comes to my mind often is, will I be able to see the actual change and the liberation of Palestine within my lifetime? And then I go back to my grandmother's words and say, if I don't see it, then there'll be generations that will see it. And I wonder what will the future generations look back at this period of time and think about both the genocide, but also what we did and our roles as activists and as academics within this journey.
On that inspiring note, I'll thank Kholoud. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking us through this journey. And we can see, hopefully, the watermelons of Palestine flourishing once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.